Hi, I want to make a video on our perception and how our perception changes and how we have a very malleable sense of the way we view things. And the way we view things constantly changes. So saying that I have an opinion, I in this present moment have an opinion. Yes, I have an opinion at this present moment. Or me brain. I have a perception right now. It's coming from this vessel that I'm speaking from. Yes, I'm seeing and I'm saying something and I'm perceiving something from a certain point of view. Yes, but that doesn't mean that I can't change, and that's exactly what can happen. I can change and something else can happen, and I can have a different perception, and that's obviously something that you have to consider, but that's something that's impractical, especially in describing certain situations where you know that you can change, but you can only go based on what you know so far and the previous changes that you've made in the past. And you can do only so much to understand what's going to happen in the future and what changes will happen in the future. And we can only do so much. We can project and see, like, oh, based on these previous things, I can possibly change my opinion, and it's about making that statement that you can be changed, the possibility of you being changed by an opinion, but it also means something. It means more that you can be changed, as opposed to you acknowledging that you can be changed, that you possibly can be, because it's obviously just a statement, and it doesn't matter if you acknowledge it or not. It's a matter of the action, the thing actually existing, something actually happening, or something actually changing. So regardless of you acknowledging it or not, sort of like existence outside of yourself, the tree in the forest falling, it doesn't need you to be there, sort of like the existence, the change doesn't need you to perceive it or be able to recognize it for it to happen. It doesn't need you to predict it for it to happen. It's going to happen, something's going to happen, and it's going to have a certain reaction in a certain it's going to have a certain reaction in a certain circumstance, and then things are going to lead from one thing to another and cause something to happen a certain way, and that's really, that's all that happens, and that's all that's going to happen. Um, so yes, our perception changes, and there's nothing more. There's a me right now, there's an I, there's something happening right now, there's a projection coming out of a vessel that I'm viewing out of, and it's going to happen a certain way, it's interacting in a certain way. I recognize this because I know, based on cause and effect, things that happen in chains based on these interactions, these chaotic interactions from our point of view, are going to have a certain interaction, they're going to happen a certain way. And I know that because things happened a certain way in the past. I know everything that has an effect based on cause and effect that happened in the past um, caused something else to happen, because everything has an effect on everything. I do this causes everything else. This has an effect on that. This has an effect on that, and they call that the butterfly effect. It just takes a butterfly landing on a tulip for something to change somewhere else. I mean, completely something else changing, because that flower, that butterfly could have been somewhere else, but that's the illusion. It wasn't going to happen any other way. And cause and effect lend you to that conclusion. They lead you to that conclusion that based on things happening a certain way in the past, they happen a certain way based on this interaction that we had, because we know that if we touch something, it has an effect, a rippling effect, may it be metaphorically speaking, on everything else, and physically, it's going to have an effect on the pillow or whatever thing that you touch in describing that situation, and that interaction has an effect on something else, and we know based on that past interaction that's going to have an effect on where we are now, and that's exactly what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a product of the past when I'm looking right where I am now. And when I'm looking where I am now, I'm looking based on the past, because it's exactly what I'm looking at, because my past, or the movement leading up to where I am now, the ephemeral movement that I'm leading up to where I am now, based on this concept of time, and change and movement, is based on some past event leading me up to where I am now. And there's no real present in describing the situation. There's just movement leading from one thing to another, and I can freeze, or I can do this or do that, and I can change things, and I can draw on something, then erase it completely. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. I mean, it left its mark anyway, but even if you could have completely erased something, wiped something out, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and it led up to where you are now. Regardless of how you can erase things or how good you can erase things, things are going to happen a certain way, and they've already happened once they've happened, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Once they've happened, and do your best, but it doesn't change the fact that it happened. It left its mark, and that's the thing. Practically speaking, you can't erase a mark that's happened. It's happened regardless. Even if you delete a file off your computer, it still existed, and it took that file delete, it took that file existing for you to delete the file to begin with, so it left its mark on you in some way or the other. So there's no way of permanently deleting something because it left its mark either in your memory or some other interaction that happened. And many of these things that we have now can't exist without our memory, or our intelligence that gives us our memory, lending us this memory that we have, and all these interactions that we have. So it leaves its mark some one way or another, and it doesn't need our recognition to exist. It exists regardless of our recognition, and even if it didn't have us. If something deleted on its own, it still existed because the interaction it had on the thing that it deleted, or whatever it may be, existed in the past, and or existed before, and it still existed now. And the interaction where it is now is based on the interaction it had in the past. And just because it doesn't exist now and it's completely erased, which it practically isn't possible, doesn't mean it didn't exist and it left its mark anyway, either through a rippling effect or whatever it may be. It existed before and it had an effect on whatever it had around it, because for something to exist, it has to have something to exist other than itself to exist, because we're in an environment, and the environment homes many different things, and the interaction one thing has with another, or the interaction it doesn't have, is a mark that it's left on this world, and regardless of it having an effect or not. It has an effect leading up from something in the past, based on a movement in the past, and it leads up to where we are now, and it had an effect regardless. So everything has an effect. Every single interaction has an effect. But sometimes we say, oh, we can't do that. We can't waste our time on that. That's a pointless endeavor. There's nothing that we can get out of this. There's nothing we can do practically speaking. Oh, let's ignore that's not important. But everything's important to a certain extent. But practically speaking, in describing a practical situation, reality, we can make value judgments, and that's what we're really doing, is making value judgments and recognizing what's more important to put our mind towards in describing a situation to make the best circumstances for either yourself selfishly, or for you and everyone else. And generally speaking, in many cases, that's what happens. You're trying to do for the best of the situation, to dissolve a situation that has to do with you. In many cases, it has to do with harming you and someone else, and it's about taking away that deprivation or suffering, and usually that involves some kind of change. So this change, yeah. So these interactions that we have mean something. They leave a mark, and everything has an effect. Everything has an effect on everything, because we're in the same system describing the system, or something in the system, in this reality, describing the reality. So we can take accountability for reality, and that usually is covered up by just raw circumstances of interaction and the chaos controlling this mechanism, based on a deterministic mechanism that controls everything we do, every single interaction we have, everything that has an effect on us, every little thing that's moving around, regardless of what it bumps into and doesn't bump into, has an effect on something. Just because something can be considered to not have an effect on something, even if it doesn't interact in a certain way, even if it's a balloon or a marble that doesn't bump into any of the other marbles, it still exists as a marble, and it still has an interaction because it exists. And that existence, by its very existence of touching the floor, can have an effect on something. So it's existing regardless. It has a weight, it has an existence, it's having an effect regardless of it actually physically touching something else that you feel like it may have an effect on. And it still has an effect regardless of there's something, have a physical being or a sentient being there to experience that effect. So we're like the tree, classic example of a tree falling in a forest. Does it make a sound? Yes, it made the sound vibrations, therefore it did make a sound. And all those little sonic booms creating an interaction, causing something to happen. And even if you didn't directly feel that interaction, it had an effect, just like everything else. But the effect was based on a previous interaction, and it's based on this chaotic mechanism of just constant interaction based on an initial cause and an effect that we will experience. And we're just in the movement, the jump that's leading to the end based on the initial cause, the first step, the first interaction that caused the foot to jump in the air. But obviously, metaphorically speaking, what caused the foot to jump in the air, but just saying a foot just magically appears and then it jumps wherever it lands. The fact that it magically appeared is the first interaction, and the interaction in the end is where it magically disappears once it hits the ground. So it magically appears on the ground, jumps, and then it ends. If any way of describing that makes any sense. Even though that's not the best example in describing the situation, I think it's good enough to describe at least a basic understanding of the mechanism at work here. It's not the best example. So, yes, I think that describes the situation I wanted to describe, and good enough. I don't know, but everything has an effect on everything, and our sense of perception, our sense of projection, our opinions, what we call an opinion, doesn't mean anything beyond a certain interaction happening at a certain point in time right now. In many cases, people are often labeled hypocrites because their opinion changes and they don't even realize it, or they don't realize they're lying and they take a different point of view, and that different point of view in and of itself is a statement and a representation of not only something like hypocrisy and lying, but it's a change of an opinion based on you maybe hiding something or covering something up. It's an interaction, and it changes an opinion. And that lie, the effect that it has on everything, has an interaction. It means something, and the interaction is um, you don't care anymore because of some interaction you had in the past. So everything based on all these interactions that means something has an effect on your constantly changing perception. That's constantly changing. Your opinions changing. I don't believe this. Well, you don't believe it now. I don't believe this now, but you're not going to say that, and it's based on descriptions and practical description. I think to a certain extent, we can all recognize that we can change our opinion regardless of our recognition or acknowledgement or not. It can happen, and it's going to happen on its own. When our opinion changes, it's beyond our control. Our opinion changes, and we're right on to defending another point of view just based on certain interactions affecting the psychology or my neurology, causing certain things to happen a certain way, and all of a sudden my opinion changes. Sort of like my thoughts change. Sort of like something changes, you all of a sudden you don't think about something, and you just write just based on your thoughts. They come from somewhere, sort of like they're beyond your control. What thought comes into your head next? Sort of like you space out, and then all of a sudden you're thinking about something. Sometimes it's hard not to space out, especially say when you're tired and you're always fighting these different things. They're just popping out of nowhere, and it's beyond your control. It only becomes beyond your control in our perception, which creates this illusion of thinking we have control to a certain extent. It begins at our and ends at our thoughts. We think, obviously, I think something through, therefore I have an effect on something, but you don't realize that that thought came from somewhere. That came from an interaction happening, a mutual interaction based on things existing in the same interactive space, and the space itself creating the interaction. So that interaction is what's creating that interaction, causing some kind of thought process. And I think we can understand that to an extent. But the illusion is still strong because we can all recognize that, okay, obviously I'm thinking this because I saw this. But we don't realize just how not us we are. I'm describing another distinction in making that even though we know it's something outside of us that gave us a certain thought process, that there's no real us to have a thought process other than an interaction and a projection that's existing inside a vessel that's interacting on it based on a predetermined mechanism that's allowing us to interact a certain way and having certain interactions that are based on previous interactions that we're having. So there's no real us. We're perceiving something and we're interacting in that. The deterministic mechanism doesn't take away from this sentience, the suffering, the feeling, and this projection, this awareness of the sentient being. They're two entirely different things, because allowing suffering defies the crude mechanism of allowing things to just happen a certain way and bump into certain things, and we're under the control of this crude mechanism. It defies that crude mechanism because it exists on a contradictory level to the crude mechanism existing, because it's allowing something to be in a non-state that it doesn't want to be and experience something, and it's experiencing something under the control of the crude mechanism controlling things in a certain way, even though the crude mechanism was the very thing that created us to begin with. So it created us, and it has an effect on us, and we're being completely controlled by it. And regardless of what we think, that thinking ends at our thinking. And obviously, to a certain extent, we can all know we have control over our thoughts, and we are still within this world. And just because we're still within this world doesn't mean that we can't take responsibility for ourselves, because we're still something in this world describing something else, interacting with something else in the world. And that means that we can take responsibility for crimes or whatever, anything that we have. And usually that's represented by consequences that we have based on, like, you commit a crime, you go to jail. Well, that's just based on circumstance and consequence. Something's going to happen. You do this, therefore this is going to happen. And something's going to happen regardless of what you think is right or wrong. And it's going to happen a certain way. And some interaction's going to happen a certain way regardless of what you want or what you don't want. It's going to happen a certain way. and it's the interaction. And just because I don't know, to determine, even though I know based on the past that something's happened, it only happened in the past, and going forward, something is completely new. And I'm inside this mechanism. Someone accuses me of committing a crime. Um, I'm responsible for the crime because I'm in the mechanism. He can just as easily label me as an asshole, for an a-hole, or accuse me of some kind of crime. I have justifiable anger towards me because if I intentionally did something, even if something had an effect on me in the past, doesn't mean that I'm not responsible for the crime. I'm just another piece of the mechanism that needs to be dealt with. And that's exactly what's going to happen based on consequences and circumstances. And I'm going to be dealt with one way or another. I get away with it, and just because you want something to happen to someone doesn't mean it's going to happen to someone. And that's where we're mixing up psychology and interactions that we have in this universe. And this interaction, this physical level of interaction. So something's going to happen a certain way, regardless of what I think or want. And the consequences is what matters. And mingling our want and our desire for someone to experience justice, say, if not taking consequence for their action based on this misconception of determinism, where you don't think no one's responsible. You are responsible, but something's going to happen a certain way, regardless of what you say. You want something to happen to someone else. And I think it's sort of like, okay, I'm aware that it's a deterministic mechanism, but I'm aware that someone committed a crime, and I want them to pay. I want them to pay their due, and I want them to. Um, I want deterrence. I want to prevent them from experiencing or committing another crime. And by doing that, I recognize it's deterministic, but that doesn't mean I can't label that person an a-hole when I know they intentionally decided to, say, rape someone against their will, and they didn't want it. And since the person didn't want it, I can label that person, an a-hole for doing a crime, committing a crime, doing something against someone else's will. And I can still do it. I'm inside the mechanism, describing the mechanism. Even though I know how the mechanism works, the illusion is moving forward. And the illusion only exists, can only be recognized by looking back and recognizing the cause and effect. But regardless, knowing that it's working a certain way, I can still say I can still accuse someone of something, but obviously based on what I accuse them, it doesn't mean anything, nor what I want doesn't mean anything, and my accusation doesn't mean anything beyond just another simple interaction. Something's going to happen a certain way, and based on consequence and how things usually end up, that person will do a certain thing, and something will happen to the person who committed the crime, and that crime, based on these things building up in this interaction of existence, will happen a certain way. Say they go to jail, and that's just based on interaction, regardless of what I think or want, because that think or want is just a physical interaction happening a different way, and the want that we have is tied to it. It exists, but it's just another interaction that's almost irrelevant on the interaction. It's a disconnection from that actual interaction in and of itself. Because it's, even though it exists and it's just a bunch of different interactions, regressive interactions leading to something, it's completely disconnected from, it's connected, but based on our perception, it's disconnected. Based on our perception, it's disconnected, and recognizing that. There's a distinction in those interactions that are happening. So regardless of me wanting it, recognizing the way things are happening. Things are happening, yes, but I can label something. I'm in this existence, describing something in this existence, of something that happened in this existence based on other people and things that have things that exist in this existence. And my description, beyond it being a description, means nothing beyond the consequences that will happen based on the circumstances that happen, based on how previous interactions have happened going forward. And regardless of what I want or I project or I feel should happen, doesn't mean anything beyond just the interaction, another interaction that's happening, having a certain, causing another interaction to happen in this existence. So it doesn't exist, and it only goes so far. And it's just my anger and my needing, my longing for revenge, or feeling like someone needs to experience justice or deterrence. It only exists on the sentient level. But since everything's working on the crude mechanism level, even on the other sentient beings that exist outside of us, we can only do so much to mitigate against this stuff, because it's coming from a sentient perspective and trying to mitigate something, and this sense of justice and sense of deterrence, because that's about reducing suffering, and that it exists on a different level than the crude mechanism. We can only do so much to change the crude mechanism at work. We can only change the crude mechanism so much, even regardless of all the technology we have. We can only do so much to change the fact that we're relying on hunger and satisfaction and deprivation to make our life worth living, and we can't change that fundamental mechanism. So yeah, we don't have control beyond a certain point, and just because we think of something, the thoughts came from something else, and even though we recognize they came from something else, there's a disconnection between really having an I and the interactions that we have. So if you know that it's just an interaction with other things, and we know the origin of our thoughts, knowing those interactions, we should just take it one step further and just recognize we're just a bunch of interactions based on interactions interacting with something else. So there's nothing more than those interactions, because our thoughts, and that's the point where we start seeing something, is the interaction and the thoughts that come from those things. And the interaction means nothing other than the thoughts that we have at that point. So the thoughts, where the idea, the mechanism begins and ends, is where we start thinking of how much control we actually have over ourselves. Because the non-control exists based on our perception. The perception that we have of control begins and ends at our thinking. But the illusion, yeah, that's where it begins and ends. The perception that we have of self-control begins and ends at thinking, and the thinking comes from somewhere, and I think to a certain extent everyone understands the interaction, but we think that our thinking comes from something inside of us, and we think the thinking is something more than just thinking. We think the thinking is based on, we know it's interaction, but we don't attribute to it to the interaction. We attribute to something happening inside of us based on a me, something that's happening inside of me, regardless of a now me existing, and that can change our perception, and our perception changes, and we really have we have a foundation, and that foundation can be, we have some bedrock, and that can be changed to a certain extent, this vessel is going to interact in a certain way. And this vessel can interact in a certain way based on different interactions, but to a certain extent there's bedrock that's laid here that can't be moved, and it's going to react a certain way, and it's going to come to conclusions a certain way.